In this video, we'll look at the period from 1848 until 1852, which ended up including two men as president, Zachary Taylor until 1850 and subsequently Millard Fillmore. When Taylor came into office in early 1849, he faced a lot of issues, but he had little preparation. He was poorly suited to the job and he had just been a military commander. Southerners were complaining about the northern states passing personal liberty laws, and they also wanted federal aid to shut down the Underground Railroad. They demanded a tough new fugitive slave law. Northerners were upset about Washington, D.C.'s growing status as a slave depot and trading terminus. I've said earlier, Washington had one of the nation's largest slave markets, especially along its waterfront, literally inside of the nation's Capitol building. The trade had gotten a lot of press in Europe and elsewhere, and growing numbers of Americans argued that there should be no slavery in the District of Columbia. Here you can see slave holding cells in Washington, D.C. With the California gold rush of 1848, 1849, thousands of people were flooding into California, which was soon populated enough for statehood. This, of course, raised the question of whether California would be a slave or free state. Obviously, since most migrants were poor, slavery had not spread as rapidly there, and most people were advocating statehood assumed it would be a free state. But obviously, a free state that would be huge and quite worrisome to Southerners. Not only were people going into California, but now with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo over, migrants were flooding into Santa Fe and New Mexico. Soon a problem emerged. Texas, which had a huge debt still from its days as an independent nation, claimed much of the same land that the new New Mexico migrants claimed. The border dispute even threatened to become violent. While all this was going on, revolutions were sweeping through Europe. 1848 was sometimes called the springtime of nations because there were democratic uprisings against a number of European monarchies. Everywhere, America's ideals of democracy and liberty seemed to be spreading. Now this, of course, just emboldened American abolitionists and made the slavery issue even bigger. Southerners were beginning to look at Cuba as a possible new state, which would, of course, be a new slave state. Indeed, more than just Southerners saw Cuba as a natural extension of manifest destiny, and recognized that Spain, which controlled it as a colony, was too weak to defend it adequately. Some Southern radicals even had wilder ambitions and later formed the Knights of the Golden Circle as kind of a fraternal organization with elaborate rituals and regalia. The Knights proposed to establish a golden circle of slave states starting in the U.S. South and extending in a wide arc through Mexico, Central America, and northern South America, including the West Indies islands. This would create about 25 new slave states for the Union. And if Congress refused to admit them, the South would secede and form a vast empire of slavery. This empire would command a majority of the world's cotton and sugar, tobacco and coffee, and it'd obviously be a superpower. Just before Taylor took office, and with the approval of the Polk administration, Americans aided a rebellion of Cuban sugar producers against Spain. They supported a Cuban leader named Narciso Lopez. Lopez, however, lost the battle and fled to New Orleans, where the people there greeted him warmly and helped him resupply and restock for a planned new rebellion. So Taylor had a lot of problems when he took office, and faced with all these problems, he was relatively slow to react, and events kind of got the momentum of their own. With Cuba, Taylor decided to stop Lopez and seize his ships in New Orleans. The people of New Orleans, however, protected him, and when federal officials charged him with a crime, New Orleans refused to convict him. Southerners were convinced that Taylor, a Whig, was trying to stop a potential slave state. In the end, Lopez made several attempts to seize power in Cuba, but without formal U.S. aid, they all failed. the issue festered throughout the Taylor administration and emerged again and again throughout the 1850s. Here you see a cartoon showing Lopez fleeing to New Orleans, and he's carrying a bag of cash he got from the Americans. Meanwhile, in 1850, the aged Henry Clay, now over 70, proposed one omnibus bill that combined a compromise in many of the issues that were troubling Taylor. The debate involved the last great effort, not only of Clay, but of the other old congressional leaders that had sort of dominated antebellum politics, Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun. Calhoun, of course, an ardent Southerner and states' rights supporter of slavery, and Webster, of course, was an ardent anti-slavery Whig. And Webster and Calhoun had fought in Congress for a while, and they would soon both die after making emotional appeals on the floor of Congress. Clay, meanwhile, envisioned his legacy as the great compromiser. He had helped craft, if you recall, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and a compromise tariff in the early 1830s that had ended the nullification crisis. And he wanted to have one more great triumph, sort of a trifecta of compromise that would solidify his reputation as the great compromiser. But of course, compromise means negotiating and each side giving up a little something, which of course is difficult to do. Parts of Clay's compromise pleased and ticked off people on both sides. In the end, while it attracted support from both moderate Democrats and moderate Whigs, Clay's omnibus bill failed to pass. Really bitter, Clay left the Senate and retired to Rhode Island, where he soon died. Here you can see his death mask. They put, when the body's there, they put clay on his face and form his death mask. And on the right, you can see a memorial ribbon from his funeral. In Clay's wake, however, stepped a new generation of leaders, including Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, shown here. Douglas, a moderate Northern Democrat, which was, of course, increasingly rare, was able to get enough support to pass Clay's compromise piece by piece, not one omnibus bill, but a series of bills. And collectively, these bills became known as the Compromise of 1850. And in terms of legacy, most credit went to Clay, and thus Clay is indeed remembered as the great compromiser. Taylor, meanwhile, wasn't much of a leader. He was fearful of the tension and disunion, and he was opposed to individual elements of the Compromise of 1850 and just pushed for California's entrance as quick as possible. But the thing was, he died suddenly right when the measure was being debated. We'll talk more about that in a second. So the Compromise of 1850s was a series of bills. One of the biggest was the one that admitted California as a free state. Now that's something that was really big, so they had to promise something big for the South, and what they said was the rest of the newly acquired land from Mexico would be decided by popular sovereignty. There would be no federal prohibition against slavery in these territories, and the popular sovereignty vote would be at the time of admission as a state, which of course was later as the South wanted. Another part of the Compromise of 1850 gave New Mexico control of the land that was disputed with Texas. Now, if you're giving New Mexico that, you got to give something to Texas. And what they said was the federal government would assume Texas's huge state debt. They had a big debt from when they were independent. The last part, the last bill, said no more slave trading in Washington, D.C. It did allow people to have personal slave ownership still, but no more slave trading. And thus we had to give something to the South, and what they got was a new and more efficient Fugitive Slave Act. This Fugitive Slave Law, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, was the toughest to get passed and the most controversial, probably of all most controversial of all the debates. Much stronger than previous laws, it allowed federal marshals, using nothing more than a slave owner's sworn affidavit, to track down and capture runaway slaves. Runaways could not be allowed to defend themselves, and the law countered the North's personal liberty laws by saying states could not interfere in the process. Citizens of the North and law enforcement officers would be required to inform and sort of assist efforts, or they could face criminal prosecution from the federal government. In the end, perhaps the Compromise of 1850 did succeed in postponing the war a decade. Many Southerners considered it a victory for the South, despite California's status as a free state. In the words of one, quote, "We of the South have a new lease for slave property. It was more secure than it had been for the last quarter of a century," unquote. What such sentiments did was sort of blunt the most rabid Southern protest, which was probably the most immediate threat to the Union. What it also did, however, was anger many moderate Whigs and help slowly grow the Free Soil Party. One of the biggest factors in getting the Compromise of 1850 passed was the sudden death of Zachary Taylor right about the time the measure came up for a vote. Taylor died of a violent stomach disorder brought on by maybe heat prostration, or he was eating fruit. There was some speculation that he'd been poisoned. As a matter of fact, years later they actually exhumed his body and checked for arsenic. But he died, and his successor would sign the bill right out of the gate. Taylor's successor was his vice president, Millard Fillmore of New York. Unlike Taylor, Fillmore was a big supporter of the Compromise of 1850, and he helped to get enough of his fellow Whigs in support, for it to pass. Afterwards, however, as more and more Whigs came to believe that it was, in fact, a victory for the South in slavery, Fillmore was increasingly unpopular in his own Whig party, and as a result, Fillmore served only 2 years, from 1850 to 1852, when the Whigs got rid of him. This concludes the video on how things progressed during the presidencies of Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore from 1848 into 1852.